400 years ago this month, the first African slaves arrived in North America on a ship landing at the Jamestown colony in what is today Virginia. Our economics reporter, Paul Solman, looks at the question of reparations, what America might owe to the descendants of these enslaved people. The subject has been gaining increased attention, even coming up in this week's Democratic presidential debates. It's the latest in our regular economic series, Making Sense, and also part of our Chasing the Dream series on poverty and opportunity in America.
I live alone.
As a little girl growing up in New Orleans, Melisande Colombe was taught that she descended from people enslaved by an Irish Catholic family in Maryland.
And that we were very important people here in Maryland, having been represented by none other than Francis Scott Key in a court case.
Yes, that Francis Scott Key. Before the U.S. Supreme Court, the fabled lawyer-lyricist represented Colombe's ancestors, suing for their freedom. But
the finding of the Supreme Court was that black people could not use hearsay to defend their right to freedom in American courts.
End of story, until she learned recently that, quote, ownership of those ancestors had been transferred to the Jesuits. And the Jesuits, in turn, had sold 2 of them as part of a deal in 1838 to keep their near-bankrupt college afloat.
It's one thing to be enslaved theoretically by an Irish Catholic family. It's a whole nother thing when you learn that that Irish Catholic family was the Society of Jesus.
The Jesuits sold 272 people in all to a pair of plantation owners in Louisiana. Colombe's family?
17 and 16 years old, and shipped to the deepest, most racist new part of America.
The college in question, Georgetown University in Washington, D.C.
The Jesuits had Georgetown. The Jesuits also had tobacco plantations, 5 of them in southern Maryland, just, 50 miles away.
Worked by people who were enslaved. When the story broke in 2016, Richard Cellini, an otherwise typical Georgetown alum, was stunned.
I'm a moderate Republican, Italian-American, have no connection to African-Americans or the history of slavery.
But he'd been taught injustice by the Jesuits. So what happened to the 272 people they literally sold down the river? The school's answer:
all of them quickly succumbed to a fever in the malodorous swamp world of Louisiana. In other words, they left no trace and no descendants. There's no point in going looking for them. And I thought, this is some sort of very powerful fever that only attacks African-American Catholic slaves from Maryland, has a 100% mortality rate. Nobody writes about it and never comes back. I thought, this doesn't make any sense.
Google reported that at least 2 had survived. A genealogist Cellini hired identified 215.
And of their descendants, we estimate that more than 4,000 of those are alive today.
Their ancestors saved Georgetown.
So naturally the question is, what do we owe their descendants? From the billions and billions of dollars that today is the collective net worth of Georgetown University and the Maryland Jesuits.
There are goodness knows how many institutions in America of which the same thing could be said, no?
Georgetown is a unique case. It's ground zero for the institutional reparations debate.
This building was built by slaves, and this building was built by slaves as well.
Georgetown, which was already in the process of renaming buildings to atone for its historical ties to slavery, also decided to make some amends to descendants, offering legacy admission status and scholarships to academically qualified descendants. Tuition, room, and board cost about $70,000 a year.
I thought about it long and hard before I made the application, because it was just a wave of so much emotion.
The 65-year-old retired cook is now a rising junior.
Do you support reparations for slavery?
And reparations on a scale far greater than Georgetown's is a rising issue in the presidential campaign. Economist William Darity and his wife, folklorist Kirsten Mullen, have been studying national reparations for years.
There are some blacks who have been very resistant in our audiences.
This will make us victims.
Yeah.
White people will look down on us. They'll have more reasons to hate us, treat us, harshly, more so than they already do.
But their audiences are more receptive to a reparation bill these days.
Also, it could include the provision of a fund that could support educational opportunities or entrepreneurial activity or improvements in community-based conditions and amenities. But we think for both symbolic and substantive reasons, a part of this must be the payment of a check to those who are eligible recipients.
And how big a check?
We start with 40 acres and a mule.
That was the promise that was never fulfilled.
A promise by Union General William Tecumseh Sherman to confiscate a huge swath of the Confederate coast and redistribute it as 40-acre plots to the newly emancipated. Assuming an acre cost something like $10 in 1865, and allowing for inflation and compound interest, Darity and Mullen put the present-day value of Sherman's promise at something like $2.5 trillion, $74,000 for each of some 35 million descendants.
The premise is that there's been a grievous injustice that has carried over multiple centuries, really.
People will say, oh, that was back then, but the fact of the matter is tremendous amounts of wealth were amassed, and only because of us.
But is there no statute of limitations on historical injustice?
Well, there's no statute of limitations if those injustices are still wreaking havoc.
Right.
The fundamental problem is the inadequate set of resources that blacks can transfer from past generations that creates the racial wealth gap. And that dynastic effect is associated with our whole history of white supremacy and racism in the United States.
On those rare occasions when we did manage to buy land and to develop it, all too often something happened, something insidious. They were cheated, someone was lynched in the family, the timing of a fire.
But of course, not everyone agrees.
You've been teaching at Brown for years.
Indeed.
Economist Glenn Lowry.
And Brown, like Georgetown, like Harvard, like Yale, was built to some significant extent by slaves, no?
Yes, that's certainly true. The Brown family fortune did have a lot to do with the slave trade. And there's nothing wrong with honoring the uncompensated labor of people who were enslaved, who built institutions like this.
But a national law.
My problem with reparations, especially as it expresses itself in terms of financial compensation, is that it misunderstands the nature of the injury, seeing blackness and African descent as some kind of subhuman category that would legitimate in the land of the free and the home of the brave, carrying on a commerce in human chattel. That was a deep and profound injury. It can't be made into a piece of cash.
But you're an economist. The legacy of slavery passed down from generation to generation, hampering, handicapping the progeny of those who were enslaved. Why not compensate them for the losses they've actually suffered?
I don't want my country to take 35 million people and so see them as mainly the descendants of slaves. 150 years? It's a very, very long time to nurture that dimension of my identity at the expense of every other aspect of my identity. African Americans like myself, we're doing fine. This is a great and open society, and we have been finally, and in the fullness of time, allowed to prosper. Those who are poor are poor. Their poverty needs to be confronted. There's no justification for giving increased attention to their poverty at the expense of other Americans' poverty.
You mean there's no difference in the legacy of a poor African American and a poor white in this country?
No difference worthy of our political attention.
Lowry has no problem with the proposed fix at Georgetown. Students there have voted for an added fee, $27.20 per student per semester for the 272 people sold, to be paid to descendants. The university has yet to approve it.
And the idea here is reparations should be made to the descendants of the people who were sold to keep the institution going.
I have a little bit of a problem with the word reparation. Black people can't be repaired in the midst of a broken white society. We cannot be repaired from racism and disenfranchisement when white supremacy continues to be a growing disease in our society.
So what word would you use?
How about some respect, some responsibility?
Acknowledgement.
Right.
This is business and economics correspondent Paul Salman reporting from Washington, D.C.